Hello. Today we're going to talk about funding your venture. It's a topic that's near and dear to every entrepreneur's heart. It's a matter of survival, and it's a matter of whether you'll be successful in your business. My name is Marie Wesselhoft, and I'm the president, founder, and a significant investor in our company, MSDx. We're commercializing blood test products for multiple sclerosis. And raising money has been something that's been on my mind since we opened our doors in 2007. And it's like nothing I've ever done before in my 33 years in business. So 4 years of raising capital does not make anyone an expert, but it certainly does teach them a lot of lessons, and you could call us a survivor. So I hope some of the lessons that I'll share with you in this session today might help you be more successful in raising capital for your business. So what are the topics that we're going to talk about? We'll talk about the different kinds of capital. We'll talk about when you raise capital, some of the different options that are available to you, and some resources that might help you. So ultimately, it's all about the investor. And the investor invests in companies. They don't invest in products. So let's start from their perspective. What types of businesses do investors invest in? So as you think about your business, you can see highlighted here, we have several different types of funding that's available to you. If you're a restaurant or a service business, you may be looking for debt, and you may be looking for loans. If you're a software company, you might go right for equity. But if you're a solar company, you will ultimately might look for money from grants. So how else do companies vary in terms of capital? The second is investors have different degrees of risk they're willing to look at. So for example, if you're an early stage company looking to launch a drug, you're going to need significant dollars, and those kind of investors are open for high levels of risk. If you're a drug company, one in maybe thousands might be successful. It'll take you on average of 12 years, and you may need $1 billion. That's a different kind of an investor than someone that looks at an IT solution. You know, low barriers of entry, easier to find capital. So first we talked about how funding varies with the type of business. This is how it varies with the kind of risk that your business has. Third, it varies over time. What you need and where you might find capital early on in the business looks entirely different when you're ready to launch and ready to start generating your revenue. So highlighted here is a continuum, an innovation continuum. And on the left, it starts with your idea, and it goes through some level of research, and then you begin to produce the product. And then as you go from left to right, you can see you're actually preparing to launch. So you'll be looking at your product, you'll be looking at team formation over time, and ultimately you can see the key thing, you'll be funding. You're looking for different sources of funding throughout this whole period of time. So it changes over time. This might be the most important slide that I'd like you to think about as you launch your business in the beginning compared to when you're generating revenue. There are multiple kinds of funding sources that are out there, and it's so important that you're going to the right funder at the right time. Early on, it's all about the founders, and you can see that highlighted on the left. Later, you may be looking for sources of funding from your grants. Then highlighted here in yellow underneath, you may be going to angel investors, high net worth individuals. And then ultimately, depending on how much money you need, you may need to go to venture capitalists, and then ultimately look for sources of debt. But the most important kind of funding you can ever get is the first dollar of revenue. But until then, these are the kind of sources that we're going to talk about over the next few minutes. So this is always an interesting pyramid, and if you can kind of look in here, this comes from the Small Business Development Center and Tom Fick. On the bottom, you can see we're talking about your own personal resources. Every investor is going to want to know how much you have in it. If you look at the top of the pyramid, it's the lottery. So probably most of you aren't going to actually get money from the lottery. That's the highest risk. But these are many different sources that you have available to you. It could be funding from your suppliers. It could be funding from your local banks, from licensing, from strategic partners. So my challenge to you is really step back and think, where am I in launching my business, and where might I get creative in finding sources of funding for your venture. So some of you may have already seen this. This is the Valley of Death. So take a minute to take a look at this. This is on the x-axis, it's how long it takes you to finally reach profit, which is on the y-axis here. So look at here, how long you're not generating revenue. For us at MSDx, and I'll share a little more about that in a few minutes, it'll be over 4 to 5 years until we actually generate our first dollar. So it's very important to know how you're going to raise money over this period of time. And then ultimately, the good news is you'll start generating revenue, and your sources of capital will really come from your customer instead of external sources. So again, remember this valley of death and make sure that you understand where you're going to be getting capital over this period of time. So what do you need to do to start to prepare to raise different kinds of financing? So you will have already heard from other videos that you may look at, people talking about the business plan, talking about your financial forecast. We're not going to talk about that today, but we're going to talk about sources of capital, but you'll need all those very important pieces when you go in to raise money from investors. But we will talk about the last two. We'll talk a little bit about valuation, and we'll talk a little bit about the exit strategy. A bit of background in MSDx. As I mentioned, that I'm one of the founders, co-founders of MSDx. We're a diagnostic company, and we have been working over 4 years, and I'd like to show you what we call the $1 million box. It's taken us $1 million of capital that we've had to raise to ultimately release our first product. So what have we done? How have we raised money over this time? Again, we're a diagnostic company, and we're focused in a couple of key areas. We're a personalized medicine solution, which means we sell blood test products to help a patient know whether or not their therapy is effective. We offer laboratory products in the laboratory testing market, which is a $46 billion market. And so in many cases, that's an attractive market to an investor. We have a proven business model. This is a high margin product, and it's a recurring source of revenue. Again, certain types of investors are looking for that kind of product. And finally, it's a product that it's our innovation, and it's a product that'll leverage to another market. So each one of these things are very important to investors. So how have we raised money? Where has our $1 million come from? So first of all, I'll talk about what's frequently called the 3 F's, family, fools, and friends. But I would like to add a 4th F to that, and that's founders. The first money for our company actually came from the 3 or 4 years, $600,000 investment. It's a major commitment for founders at this period of time. But we needed to reach a very significant milestone before we could go externally. We also, as part of our $1 million, received over $430,000 from grants, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. So again, this is where our first $1 million had come from. Now, last of all, we've begun raising money from the angel investors, and at this point in time, we have over $200,000 raised from our local and also national investors. So it's a little bit like chutes and ladders. I picked this graphic because it's one step forward and it's another step backward, and it reminds me of some of the games we used to play. Just when you think you're making progress, then you're going in another direction. So let me talk a little bit about some of our lessons of the do's and don'ts. What are some of the do's? Number one, make sure that you really know your investor. Every investor is different. You need to go to the right investor. It's not just an investor. For us as a diagnostic company, it doesn't help us if we go to somebody who knows real estate. We have to make sure we're matching the kind of investor to the kind of company that we are. Some of the don'ts, again, it's not about us, it's not about a product, it's about a company. It's about when they're going to get their money out. It's about the risk portfolio. So there are a number of things that we'll talk about in a few minutes in terms of what you can do to increase the probability of you successfully raising money. So now let's talk about your early investors. Money from your founders, from your family, from your friends, and anyone that'll come in early when the risk is high. A couple of key things to think about. First of all, no one will fund your job. They fund companies, they fund businesses, they fund innovation. They fund a company that's going to give them a good return on their investment. They won't fund you in your job. Often I talk to entrepreneurs and they think that in the middle of after losing their job, they're going to become entrepreneurs. That isn't the way it works. So think about it long and hard before you leave your day job. Another source of funding from your friends, credit card. Those credit cards, all of your founders can basically take credit cards. Again, a very important source of revenue, but it's going to be your neck on the line that you're going to have to sign for those kinds of funds that will be available. Very risky. It's an early time, very important, but make sure that you think long and hard about how you will commit to funding during this early time. I often say to my family and my kids, they'll come and they'll want to go out to dinner, and I'll say, dinner for you or another sample for our company. It's a family decision in many cases when somebody's involved in launching an early stage business. But again, an important source of revenue and your first source of capital. Also, early on, you may find creative sources of debt that are available to you. We already talked a little bit about credit card, but there's always an obligation to pay for credit card. Interest bearing. But you may need a significant piece of capital equipment. There are companies that actually lease these pieces of capital equipment, so you can very early on have access to the kind of capital you need by loans and people that focus on these kinds of businesses. So now let's talk about a very important source of capital for almost every company, and that's grants. And it's never too early to begin to think about and to begin to go after grants. You'll have another entire session and video on grants, but I'd like to talk about some of the lessons that we've had as we've gone after different grants. First of all, the government commits a significant amount of money for innovation. And they take, so things like the National Science Foundation, the National Institute of Health, the Department of Defense, and they fund significant projects around that. But the government must allocate 2 to 3% of those research funds to support startup companies like us. And that's called an SBIR and that's called an STTR. So there are over $2 billion available. So I'm sure you're asking, how do I find out? Again, there are very significant pages that are available to you on grants.gov that can tell you the different agencies that have funding available for the SBIR and the STTR product. So let me tell you a little bit about what we've learned. First of all, you should always have at least one grant you're working on and another grant that you've already submitted. It takes an average of a year to work through a grant, 3 to 4 months to go after writing the grant, another 6 months to review that they will use in reviewing that grant, and then even if they award it to you, it's another 2 to 3 months before you see money. So I want to make sure I adjust your expectations. It's at least a year if you're successful in getting money. Hence, the earlier you start, the better. Now, what are the odds that you might get grants? So let me tell you our average. We've gotten 2 out of 4 grants. So what does that mean? You'd better be working on a lot of grants. And on average, in early technology companies will get 30 to 40% of their money from grants. So it's never too early to start. Now, a couple of do's and don'ts about grants. Don't take your grant, the same grant, and submit it to multiple organizations. Make sure you understand what each agency needs and tailor your grant proposal to that. Second of all, make sure that you have taken care of all of the paperwork. One story we'd worked over 3 months on a grant. We were ready to submit. We started uploading that grant 2 weeks before, only to find out that our application had expired, and it takes well over a month to get through that process. So all the way up to the last date at 5 o'clock, it never went through. So we had worked months only to find out we couldn't even submit it. So make sure you cross all the T's, dot all the I's, and do what you need to do to make sure that you've got everything covered and you've done as good a job as you can for a grant submission. Think of it this way. It's at least $100,000 to a recent company out at the Arizona Center for Innovation recently secured $1.6 million in a phase 2. So every page you do, it's an investment. Think of investing at least a week on every page that you write for grants. Again, another good source of revenue. Now, why is it important for grants? You don't have to pay them back. These are grants to you. This is non-dilutive capital. It's an endorsement it's almost validation from somebody who understands your market. Investors will look very favorable if you have successfully gotten some grants. So I can't say enough about this. I know I'm on a roll of grants, but it's very important. We've received 2 grants, both for commercialization, and the grant that we're working on right now will allow us to launch our first product. So we've received the first grant, a qualifying therapeutic grant, funded through stimulus package. That was over $204,000. And then recently, the Arizona Commerce Authority released an innovation set of grants. And there were 108 companies that went after these grants in the state of Arizona. We were one of 8 that actually received it. So again, these are very important. Of our $1 million, over $430,000 came from grants, and we do not have to pay this back, and again, it's non-dilutive. So what are some of the agencies? So for us, because our market is in multiple sclerosis, and we're focused on products to help monitor therapeutic effectiveness in MS, the Multiple Sclerosis Society is another source of revenue. The National Science Foundation and NIH. So what you need to do is step back and think about your company. Is it a solar company? What are the sources of funding for that? So now we're going to move from grants. We talked a little bit about family and friends and founders. We talked a little bit about grants. And now we're going to move into the next phase. When you've met very important milestones, you've now earned the right to go to what's known as angel investors. Now, early on, I come from big corporations, and we had received money from shareholders and stockholders. I had never heard of an angel investor, and it's not something spiritual. Truly, it's an early stage investor that comes in, and they're willing to take the kind of risk that they need to take on for an early stage in a company. So key things to consider. These investors invest and provide money to you for launching your business in exchange for a piece of your business. So you have to be prepared to give up a significant percentage of ownership. There are angel groups, there are individual investors that are angels, but let's talk a little bit about what qualifies somebody as an angel investor. To be an accredited investor, there are certain criteria that you can find on the Angel Capital Association website, but they're listed here if you want to look at them. They have to hit certain hurdles of $1 million in net worth. Generally, they invest between $25,000 and a couple $100,000. So it's not the millions of dollars. These are smaller investors. And generally, they invest in several companies. So they diversify their portfolio to diversify their risk. Now, a typical angel investment may have a round of between $250,000 to $1 million. But much larger than that, you're going to have to go to the next level investor, which is a venture capital. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. But of course, they want something in return, and they're going to want a piece of your company. So you have to be prepared and ready for that. So how many angel organizations out there? These are some statistics from the Angel Capital Authority, Angel Capital Association again. In the year 2000, there were over 100 angel groups, but by 2006, there were already 250. So if you go to that website, you can see all of the different angel groups that might be in the geography that you're launching your business. A little bit about how large the rounds are, how much people invest. So there's a lot of statistics. But again, what's important for you to know is how much does a typical investor invest. And generally, they come in as individuals. So a little bit about us and how long it took us to work through the angel investment. So located here in Tucson, the Desert Angels is a very, very active angel group. And when you look across the country, they have a great reputation. So we're fortunate to have access to that kind of capital here in Tucson, Arizona. There are also very good organizations up in Phoenix as well. So our state is blessed with a number of very active angel groups. For us, our first investors, over $150,000, actually came from the Desert Angels. But I want to make sure that I mention to you is that while we started working on that over a year ago, it took over a year to get our first check. So it's not a fast process. So don't think that you're going to turn on a dime, go in, wow them, and walk away with a couple $100,000. It's a very long and arduous process, and you have to make sure that you've got the right strategy to approach these investors. But once we had secured our initial investment from our Desert Angels, then we could start to move beyond the local investors. And for me, that meant reaching back out to Chicago, where I have a lot of contacts there. But again, you have to start with your local investors, because any investor wants to make sure your local angels are supporting you as a company. So then we went, again, being a woman-managed company, we have access to several different groups, one of them being the Golden Seeds, and the Golden Seeds invests in women-managed companies. So make sure that you understand what resources and what angel groups might be specific to the kind of companies. If you're a life science company, there are angel groups that specialize in life science. There's green tech angel groups. So again, what's important is that you're focusing on the right group, the right kind of investor. Now, a few other stories. Early on, the gentleman highlighted here on the right was one of the first investors that was willing to put a deal out on the table. And his deal was, I'll match the first investor up to $100,000. Well, having that kind of support early on from an investor is very important. Who you get as investors, these people are your supporters early on. If there is something that's very exciting going on, the first people we reach back out to are our investors. So again, think of your investors as not just a source of capital, but a source of very important contacts back into your markets. What are some of the resources available to you? I keep talking about the Angel Capital Association. This is their website here. This is our website for the Desert Angels. Another website that I don't have on here, but everybody should know about, is AngelSoft. If you go on to even the Desert Angels and you go to submit your investment package, it'll take you to a program called AngelSoft. Well, you can load all of your information on AngelSoft, and then you can take that same information and leverage it to multiple groups. You can find all of the groups that are registered across the country. You can find when they invest in, what kind of businesses they invest in, and how busy they've been. So in the last couple of years, this has been a wealth of knowledge that's available to anybody launching a company, particularly if they're focused on angel groups. So a little bit more, it's a tough environment right now. You know, everybody knows that people are a lot more risk adverse than they were, and these are some of the statistics of how many actually get invested in. So I want to make sure we adjust your expectations in terms of how long and how easy or difficult it is to actually raise money. This is a question for you. Does my company qualify for angel investment? Am I really willing to give up this kind of control? Do I realize that they're going to have voting rights? They're going to ask, how much do you have invested? How much sweat equity do you have into the company? What kind of return? Ultimately, at the end of the day, the investor wants to know what kind of return they'll get and over what horizon. These are individual investors, and in many cases, you know, they have to make sure that your exit, the time that you will sell the business or that they will get their money back out, fits in their horizon. So if they've retired and, you know, they don't want to wait for 10, 15 years until they get a return on your investment. So make sure that they understand and you've matched yourself to somebody who is willing to have an exit in 3 years versus an exit in 7 years. So they'll want to know that kind of information. So why investors turn down deals? And I challenge you all to think about this. It's about, in many cases early on, it's about the team. It's not about one individual. It's about the team. So I want to make sure I reinforce this. And I know you will have heard, you have the other videos available to you on leadership and team management, but I can't stress enough. In many cases, they're betting on the group, because where you start out might be totally different than where you end up. So it's important that they believe that you can get the job done. rate of market growth. They might not be attracted to a small niche market. In our case, a $40 billion market isn't as big as a $700 billion market. So you've got to make sure your investor agrees with the size of market, how competitive it is, and barriers of entry. So, a couple key things as you set your strategy for going after angel investors. How much money are you going to need? So think about this a minute. Never raise more money than you need to get to your next value point. And that's because you don't want to ever give up more of your company than you need to. But never run out of money. And that's a very fine balance, but you're going to need to think, how much money do I need to get to revenue? How much money do I need to get to a clinical study being done? Think about the key milestones you have in your business and how much money it's going to take to get to that. And that's the size of your round. And then based on that, we get at the infamous question is, what's the valuation? So there's a lot of philosophies on valuation. I've gone to several different business schools. I've heard at least 3 or 4 financial ways of coming up with a valuation. But at the end of the day, in my mind, it's more of a black art. It's more of a real estate deal. What are other comparable businesses going for, and what's their pre-money value? So you're going to need to think about this. And why are you going to need to think about this? This is going to set how much of the company that you're going to have to give up. So that's a very, very important part of the negotiation. So a little bit more on valuations. In general, let's say that you're raising $1 million, and let's say that your pre-money is $1 million. So here you're asking for $1 million, your pre-money valuation is $1 million. How much of the company are you going to need to give up? You're going to need to give up 50% of the company for that $1 million. So that's why it's important. But let's say your pre-money value is $2 million, but you still need $1 million. You're going to have to give up 33% of the company. Big difference between giving up 50% of your company versus giving up 33%. So how does the math work? Pretty simple. What do you need to raise? What is your value? And the numerator is how much money you need to raise. The denominator is how much money, what your pre-money value is, plus what you're raising. So again, my example, if I need $1 million and my pre-money is $1 million, 1 divided by 2, guess what? 50% of the company is what you're going to have to give up. So think long and hard as you talk about valuation. Go to people who understand the business. Work with your advisors. Talk to other friendly investors. This is really important that you think through this, both from a negotiation perspective and early on. So valuation, other things they take into consideration for valuation. Many cases in terms of the valuation, they rate the management team 30% of the valuation. They'll want to know how much money do you have in, what kind of intellectual property that you have, how large is your market, how easy is it to access your customers. And they rate these to ultimately come up with valuation. Lots of good books, and in fact, I'll share one with you at the end of the sessions. The due diligence process. What in the world is due diligence? So finally, you're in front of the investors. They've said, yes, I might be interested. The next step of the process is they need to do their due diligence on you. Generally, there'll be somebody that will take a lead. A lead investor will actually do the diligence. For us, it took over 4 months to get through the due diligence process. So it's very important that you have everything lined up. Again, all your T's crossed, all your I's dotted. Very important information, and you won't believe what you need to disclose and help them understand your business. But once the due diligence is done and they give you a thumbs up, then in general the groups are ready to invest. But again, think of how long this process is. That earns you the right, once you've made it through due diligence, to now start negotiating the term sheet. So again, pre-money valuation, the due diligence process, and then ultimately negotiating your term sheet. Your term sheet will tell you how much of the company you need to give up, how many people on the board, all of those key things. And some of the terms are highlighted here. So for us, for MSDx, we again had to come up with a pre-money value. This was our A2 round, and our current round is for $730,000. You'll need to decide whether or not you're going to offer any incentives. And for us, we've offered some warrants for early investors that come in. They'll be asking you things like liquidation preference. Who gets their money out first? Do the last investors get their money out before you? things like anti-dilution and how many board members. So these are the kinds of things that you need to think about in your term sheet. Now you might say, where in the world do I begin with the term sheet? The first place is go again to the Angel Capital Association website. Guess what? There's an approved term sheet on there. But second of all, probably the most important is hopefully by the time that you're in front of angels, you have a very good corporate attorney that understands that. We have an advantage here in Tucson. We have several good options as attorneys that understand small businesses like us. So make sure you've got somebody that can help design and work with you on your term sheet. Next, you finally raised your angel round, and now you're ready for your next round. Your next round is typically, if you continue to need money before revenue, it might be your venture capital. So this is a nice chart that lays out, again from the Angel Capital Association. You'd think I'm getting money or a kickback from the Angel Capital Association, but this is the kind of information that you can find. So you can see the number of investors. There's 400,000 angel investors. There's less than 1,000 venture capital. So here are the different criteria. How many deals do they do? What's the size deal? So again, our next round is going to be between $2 and $4 million that we estimate at this time. So we again won't get that from angels. We'll be needing to go to venture capital. These people are very specific to market. So think through at what point in time might you need venture capital. A few other things about venture capital. They specialize by industry segment. They specialize by geography. But again, one of the key things that our angel investors always want to know is they never want to leave their money stranded. So they care about where you're going to get your next investment. In fact, sometimes they won't even invest till they know that you have your venture capital laid out. So if you need $5 million and the first $1 million is coming from angels, you have to know how you're going to get to your first venture capital. If there's one thing that I get asked often is before they even ask about how your business is going, they want to know who was your last investor this week. So again, remember, they care about the next investor, so their money is never left stranded. So venture capital, one of the key things is every investment requires an exit. So a couple of key points. Investing only works if the investor can get their money out. You would say, yeah, that's very logical. But again, they're not investing forever. They want to know at what point in time will they get their money out. And how do they get their money out? Well, the days of going public are basically gone. So they're looking for an exit. And what's an exit? An exit is somebody acquiring your company so that at that period of time, these investors, the early investors, can cash out their money and get a return on their investment. So they want to know before they invest how you're going to exit. Now, you may say, I'm looking to build a company for the next 30 years. That isn't always in the best interest of that investor unless they know they can get their money out. So again, make sure you understand what's your goal. Are you a lifestyle business or are you a technology business? Because again, that ultimately sets up what your strategy is for securing capital. Another really good resource, PricewaterhouseCoopers Money Tree Report. I would advise everybody who thinks they might be going for venture capital. It's free. Go on their website. They'll tell you who invested in what. This is public information. So these venture capital firms need to disclose. They have very important requirements with the IRS. So you can find valuable information out about every deal that was done every year in every sector. One more comment on exit. For us, I'm trying to weave in some examples about MSDx as a company. When we go in front of investors, we talk about a couple of things. We have an exit either through an acquisition, so to an investor, they can get their money out in acquisitions, or we might expand other businesses and then they can get their money out at that time. One of the things that we did early on is set up a Google alert. Why in the world would you need to set up a Google alert? You should set up a Google alert so that every day you look at every exit or every acquisition that might have come down in your business. So with a simple Google alert, you can start to begin to know there were 31 acquisitions over the last 18 months. They generally sold for 3 to 4 times revenue. How would you know that unless you're tracking your market? So again, what you need to do is begin accumulating very important information for your investor that can tell them what is the exit environment in the segment or the business that you're launching. Now, I'm sure you're probably saying, wow, I'm overwhelmed. We've shared so many things. You have to go through it step by step, but again, make sure you're using all of your resources available, and that's really my message to you on exits. You won't know what acquisitions are in the market unless you keep a pulse on that all the time. So, a couple of closing slides now. First of all, what are some of the lessons that I've learned? Number one, you're never done, ever done. And so just because you've gotten your investor, celebrate that day and move on the next day to figuring out what you have to do. Make sure you're allocating enough of your time to not only think about running the business, but think about securing your next investor, or think about communicating with your last investor, but you're never done. The second is that they don't really care about you or your company. They care about what return they're going to get from your company. So it's not about you, it's about the investor. It takes 100% longer than you think. I would actually say for us, it probably was 300 times longer than we would think. Investments are in companies, not products. They don't care about your product, they care about your company. Nothing is as scary as payroll without any cash. So, you go day by day, make sure that you have enough money and you're not running out of money. Multiple sources, you aren't going to get it from one source. Make sure you got your grants going, government contracting, your Chase and Wells Fargo bank, your leasing. So again, it's not one kind of capital, it's multiple. Always do the right thing. You might say, wow, what is this, a lesson in values? At the end of the day, only you know whether it's right. And you're going to be challenged and pushed by a lot of people as you're raising capital. But you've got to make sure that it's right. And so, you're going to be in this for the long term. They might be in it for the short term. So as you raise capital, don't compromise. The best capital is revenue. So here I've talked all of this time about investors and banks, etc. But at the end of the day, it's about the first dollar. It's about the first dollar from your customer. So make sure your investors know that that's what you're focused on. And as soon as you can find any source of revenue, it's critical that you do that, because you don't owe them a return at all, and you've earned the right with your customer. So make sure that while you're thinking about all of this raising capital, never forget about revenue and sales. So in summary, where are you going to, multiple sources of capital at multiple times within your business, all along the continuum. Make sure you have a strategy. Don't ever get caught in one without being 3 steps ahead in your others. And make sure you use all of your resources. So speaking of resources, one of the slogans I always have is, I'm as good as the last book I've read. So make sure that you're using some of the tools that your investors will know about. Guy Kawasaki with The Art of the Start, he has a new book called Reality Check. If you want to know some of the financials, he's got great statistics in here. Of course, you'll have another session on business plan and another videos, but make sure your business plan is up and current up on AngelSoft. And at one point in time, and many points in time, you're probably going to ask the question, when do I quit or do I stick? And this book, Seth Godin, When Do I Quit and When Do I Stick? It's called The Dip. It's about a 20-minute read, and it's something that I've read multiple times. And then Early Exits, really good book on early exits. So I could give you more, but these are just a couple of tools, and they're in audio. So those of you who like to do audiobooks, all of these are in audio, and the information is here. So again, when you start down the path of raising money, you think that you understand, but one of the phrases I always say is the arrogance of ignorance. And so sometimes ignorance is bliss, and that's what gets us started. But regardless of how fearful it may seem, make sure that you move forward. And if you think about all of the tools that are available to you, and you're thinking about them as a customer, the investor as a customer, those are the kinds of things that help guarantee success. Thank you.